Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast, recorded on stage at CDMO Live Europe 2026 in Rotterdam. This episode is sponsored by PharmaBlock, a fully integrated CRDMO providing research, development and manufacturing services from early discovery to commercial production.
If there's one thing shaping pharmaceutical manufacturing right now, it is geopolitics. So geopolitics used to be a background noise for pharma. It isn't anymore. It's now sitting in the boardroom, shaping which markets you launch in, where you manufacture, and whether your R&D pipeline survives the next election cycle. The politics behind the pipeline explores exactly how global rivalries, from Washington's MFN pricing to China's R&D push, are rewriting the rules of this industry in real time. I'd like to welcome EU Correspondent of Dagens Pharma, Cristoffer Frendesen, and I'm sure Gil Roth might not need much introduction in this industry, President of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. So Gil founded the trade body PBOA in 2014 to represent CMOs and CDMOs with the FDA, Congress and the White House. Cristoffer here, EU Correspondent of Dagens Pharma, is based in Brussels, where he spent many years as a policy and press advisor inside the European Parliament. So he covers pharma and health policy news, cutting through the Brussels noise and to report what actually matters for this industry. Tell me about that, Cristoffer. So you're inside EU policy making. What is actually happening right now? What are the key policy changes that you're talking about?
It's a huge question, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's very nice. It's a huge question because there are a lot of stuff moving right now. Very recently, there was a political agreement on the Critical Medicines Act, which of course is very important for industry and also patients. They are essentially trying to ensure that European patients have access to critical medicines. Of course, very important. In the legislation, there's also provisions to attempt at least to boost European manufacturing. Whether or not that's enough, that's the big question looming over the whole legislation. Last year in December, a very important legislation was also agreed. It was the Pharma package. Essentially, all conditions for the pharmaceutical industry was decided in that legislation or that package. It's still uncertain how it will affect, how it will actually pan out. And we'll have to see. But already when it was agreed, a lot of industry actors were critical of it, especially the fact that they were trying to limit or at least not increase or strengthen the data protection and market protection that received a lot of criticism from industry. And also there's one specific provision in the legislation that an obligation for pharmaceuticals to launch in all EU states if they request it. This has become controversial due to the Trump MFN policy, because if you are forced to launch in all member states, if they request so, of course that could be a challenge, especially if you're forced to launch in a reference country. So this provision has created more uncertainty, and it actually might prevent pharmaceuticals or pharmaceutical companies from launching medicines in Europe. So it's very controversial. Other than that, you also have the current negotiations for the EU budget from 2028 to 2034. Of course, it's a massive amount of money, but the issue is that there might not be that much money for health. In fact, they removed the separate health budget. The European Parliament is trying to revive that, but that will be an uphill battle, at least. There is also a part of the budget that is attempting to boost scale-up, making it easier for companies to scale up. But that will also, that is a huge problem in the EU, and whether or not that has enough money, that is uncertain. Probably not, as if you ask the industry. And apart from that, one of my key focuses over the last month have been the MFN policy, Most Favored Nation policy, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And that has proven to be a major concern. It is most likely going to affect not only medicine launches, but also national health systems, and thereby also patients. So this is a big concern, and so far the EU has remained more or less silent on this topic. There might be a good reason for that, and we'll come back to that later, I'm sure. But the EU has remained more or less silent on this. So there is a hope that something might happen, but yeah, I guess we'll get into the details later. Oh yeah, I forgot one thing. The Biotech Act is also being currently negotiated. The Biotech Act 1 came out last year and is currently being negotiated, and its follow-up, its twin The aptly named Biotech Act 2 is coming in the fall. And of course, it's still uncertain what it's going to entail and what it's going to produce, but there's big hopes for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Gil, does that sort of match the picture you're hearing within the industry?
Things are somewhat insane when it comes to U.S. policy and how it's impacting pharma overall and the CDMO sector within it. Certainly a lot of the European factors that you talked about are at play, coming from an America-centric point of view, which is very unfortunate. A lot of the policies under discussion right now, particularly around tariffs and most favored nation pricing, are intended to impact who's manufacturing what and where. And very recently, the U.S. Department of Commerce put out a notice on eligibility for getting out from under pharma tariffs under the new administration's Section 232 pharma sector national security tariffs that really involve multiple steps, starting with demonstrating some form of onshoring of manufacturing of certain drugs to get from a 100% tariff if you're not from a country or region with a trade agreement down to 20% and then negotiate most favored nation to get down to 0%. But they put out some criteria and clarification for how to qualify for these things that are onerous, to say the least, involving companies having to really declare exactly how much of any product is going to be made in different regions, for which markets, what the values are, etc. While at the same time, at least thanks to some PBOA efforts, including contract manufacturing in the U.S. as one of those onshoring criteria. We really kind of worked to explain to the Department of Commerce that while the administration wants everybody to build in the U.S. and make everything there for the U.S. market solely, potentially for global markets, not everybody can. Not every drug company has the resources for that capital outlay. The equipment, the workforce, et cetera, doesn't exist. You need CMOs, and that's what we tried to get across to Commerce, and they did listen when it came to establishing those criteria. But there's still a lot of questions to be answered, and that's just on the onshoring MFN tariff matrix, along with all the other factors that are at play.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's continue talking about the US for a second then. How much, Gil, would you say this is a Trump-term problem versus something that maybe is a longer-term sort of something that affects strategy?
It depends. Nobody knows anything is always my number one piece of advice about all this stuff. The first Trump administration instituted tariffs on steel and aluminum using that same national security Section 232 probe, as it's known in U.S. parlance. The Biden administration never removed those tariffs. So there's always the potential that some of the things that are instituted this time around will continue under subsequent administrations, maybe changing a little this way or that. The Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which involved creating some ability for Medicare to negotiate prices with particular drug companies, and that's been continued and used as a lever by the current administration. So while I think some of the onshoring push may die down with subsequent administrations, I think some of the pricing issues may continue, and that's going to create a good deal of complexity. One of the things Cristoffer mentioned, which I'm very concerned about, is the possibility of lack of patient access outside the U.S. If a launch would trigger MFN pricing back in America, do certain drug companies hold off on some of those launches? And that's not good for anybody, patients, the market authorization holders, or the CDMOs who support them.
So, Cristoffer, is there a sort of a coherent European response forming around this, or is it still scrambling to keep up?
There's still a lot of scrambling. There's no coherent effort as of yet. And as Gil just said, there's already data showing that launches are decreasing in the EU after the announcement of the MFN policy. So already it might be having an effect. And of course, this has been known by the EU Commission for a long time, but it's hard for them to really act because they don't have the competence on health. That is a national policy area, that's a national responsibility. And for a lot of these countries, it's very difficult to really do something about because they are very small actors. Like, for instance, Denmark, I'm from Denmark, or Malta, they will have a hard time coming up with individual solutions. And also even bigger players like Germany or France might struggle to come up with the right solution for this. I know a country like Denmark, they've put down a task force, and when there's a task force, things are about to happen. But surprisingly, not a lot has happened as of yet. They put down the task force, I think in February, or announced it at least, and then we had an election and nothing has happened. I tried to figure out what they are planning to do, but they didn't want to tell me until now at least. But they hinted at that there is going to be a national response, and also they're going to try to pursue a European response. What that is going to be, it's unsure. They will try to, at least I know MEPs in the European Parliament, politicians there, they will try to push for a more unified approach to procurement, or to, of course, trying to reshore manufacturing as well. But the funds are limited within the EU and also within member states, so it's very hard to see what the approach will be right now. So yes, they are scrambling.
Let's continue this EU versus US rhetoric we've got going here. So obviously the MFN logic is pushing companies to prioritize US launches, but obviously FDA disruption is something we haven't mentioned too much yet. The ongoing FDA disruption might be pushing companies the other way. Cristoffer, is Europe actually positioned to capitalize on all this FDA disruption, or is it moving too slowly?
That's a very good question, and of course there is an opportunity for the EU to profit from this insecurity and from the disruptions in the US. Unfortunately, I think Europe is in a difficult position. For years already, there have been decreasing amount of clinical trials compared to the global share within Europe. It has been decreasing for years, for decades. On top of that, you have a continuous lack of investment compared to, for instance, compared to the US. And furthermore, you also have, I think, between 2019 and 2025, there was the biotech companies that listed on the stock exchange. Like almost all of them, I think, apart from one or two, they all listed outside of the EU. Of course, that's a huge problem. And also you have new active substances not being launched or used in Europe. So the problems are massive. And the key fix to that, or at least one very important solution to this, is to complete the fabled almost European Savings and Investment Union. And things are moving very slow, as they tend to do, and it's unsure if it will ever be realized, to be honest. So yes, there is an opportunity for the EU to benefit from this uncertainty and disruptions in the US, but I think maybe other regions or countries such as China might be in a better position right now to exploit the situation.
Interesting. So Gil, tell me about the CDMO perspective here. What are you hearing from your members about Europe versus US?
I'll say, a lot of things are driven by that America first / onshoring move. And some of this stuff we've seen since COVID onwards, where there were regions that started to realize they needed greater investment in particular types of manufacturing. The EU certainly saw some of its shortfalls when it came to different types of manufacturing during COVID. Canada discovered that it had no vaccine capacity internally and basically had to work with CEPI to try to get vaccine supplies. With the current move towards onshoring, there are CDMOs who are seeing a lot more interest in tech transfers from ex-US projects into the US. Some non-US CDMOs have been buying US operations to establish a footprint here, which I'll talk about in my presentation shortly. We're also seeing some degree of, we'll say, the overall need for onshoring investment, or the push for it from this administration, has led to a lot of multi-billion-dollar announcements by in-house pharma, but also multi-million-dollar announcements from US CDMOs who are seeing more opportunity and options for attempts at growth into particular dosage forms in certain areas. I think the area where we still see a huge bottleneck is in APIs, which most of my members are more on the dosage form side, but from an API end, we still see a significant imbalance where a lot of the manufacturing takes place, and the fact that so much of that is driven by cost. And that's simply the labor costs in the US, environmental costs, US and in Europe, mitigate against a lot of that sort of investment taking place.
So if you were advising a mid-size CDMO, say, in this room, what does a smart hedging strategy look like?
Depends on what form they're in. If you're sterile injectables, you've probably still got a good deal of either GLP-1s or the halo effect of all the non-GLP-1s that needed investment. Within oral solids, there are particular technologies and modalities to approach. It's a question, are you working with innovators? Are you working with generic customers? We just finished negotiating the FDA generic drug user fee amendment to try to protect the generic industry's ability to get drugs reviewed and marketed in a timely manner. Innovators just finished the same thing with the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. A lot of that, though, will be contingent on FDA's ability to, initially I would say FDA's ability to hire all the staff to replace staff who were let go last year during the big DOJ cuts. At the very moment we're recording, they also need to hire a commissioner, a head of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Biologics Evaluation and Research, and several other major roles within the agency. So there's issues at the very top, but a lot of issues throughout the workforce at FDA that I think are going to impact companies' decisions from a client side and for CDMOs ultimately.
Great, thanks for that. And before we wrap up, let's do a bit of a quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Based on what we've discussed today, what's the one policy reality that should be changing how companies in this room should be thinking?
You go first.
I'll try. To be honest, as I said, there's much going on within the EU legislative-wise, but I think the biggest policy challenge, or I think that's MFN right now. That is what is starting to grip the attention of policymakers, even within the European Parliament and nationally. So I think that's the biggest challenge right now, and it will affect medicine prices, national health systems, and of course patients. Even patient organizations that I've talked to are suggesting to maybe increase medicine prices in the short term. And if patient organizations suggest higher prices, you know that there is a real concern out there.
Okay, Gil?
I'll echo everything he said, but since you already nailed it, I'll say some of this stuff also impacts the U.S. significantly. I would jump on top of that, so I don't cover the same area you did, and I would say some of that FDA overhaul and the impact it has on R&D consistency in terms of FDA's ability to review drugs in a consistent manner in a way that companies are willing to make R&D investments. We saw some real problems last year with drugs getting a refuse to file or getting rejected in phase 3 for things they thought FDA was in agreement with when it came to clinical data, et cetera. If that sort of thing continues over the next several years, that could impact investors' decisions about staying in the pharma R&D space. That means fewer drugs would get developed, CDMOs would be impacted by all the support services they would not be hired for, and patients would suffer ultimately from a lack of new options coming on the market. So tariffs, MFN, and onshoring is one thing, and then some of this FDA consistency for sure.
And ultimately it does always come back to the patients. Thank you, Cristoffer and Gil, for talking to me today.